So, I mean, to start off with, I'll just give everyone a little bit of a background on the Detox Project. We set up in 2014 to test human samples all over the world. So we've been testing urine, hair, breast milk, and blood samples for different government organizations, from groups within the European Parliament to the Japanese government, Australian government, and now a little bit in the Chinese government as well. We generally test for glyphosate and a group of ubiquitous pesticides for long-term exposure through hair testing. And we also concentrate on making people aware of their long-term exposure. So we do a lot of media work surrounding the testing work that we do. Some of the testing is done in the European Union, in France, and some of the testing is done in Pennsylvania. So that is actually how we started the Detox Project, pretty much focusing entirely on human exposure. But obviously, following that, the roots of human exposure were very important to find out why so many people were having long-term exposure, and specifically to glyphosate. So in 2016, we started testing foods across the US, lots of different types of food, mainly wheat, oats, soybeans, and legumes at first. But then after we released some of that testing in 2016 to the public, lots of brands started to become interested in certifying their specific brands as glyphosate residue free. So in 2017, we started the certification. Certification at first was only slowly picked up. I think we had 2 brands within the first 6 months, but the last 2 years has, to tell you the truth, been completely crazy. We've grown faster than we've imagined. I think it's the 3rd fastest growing foods or supplement certification in the US now, with 85 brands and about 2,700 products certified. Most of those at first were honey, supplements, cereals, pretty much products which had the main desiccated or pre-harvest sprayed ingredients in. But now in the last 6 months, we're having lots of ingredient suppliers and also a real vast variety of products coming through. One of which is, I talked to Chris probably 3-4 months ago, is becoming more and more wine brands, vineyards are getting certified. We've actually just arrived back from France, where we've been working with the Environment Ministry on a project to certify French wine from next year for glyphosate residue free, because obviously they're phasing out glyphosate, and one of their first phase outs in France is going to be on vineyards, so they want to have some sort of commercial edge, and so they're looking at getting a large number of vineyards and wine brands certified from the middle of next year. In the US, mainly we've been certifying vineyards in California and Washington, but we've seen growing interest from elsewhere as well. But it's literally there wasn't much interest from vineyards and wine brands before say March, April this year. So that's picking up quite quickly. And also other alcoholic beverages such as beer, vodka, and a few others which we're starting to certify, and actually the first beer brands going through certification as we speak. So yeah, that's the general background on where we're at. There's a lot of interest in glyphosate in general. I think amongst consumers, it's been building a lot over the last year for two main reasons. One is the classification by the International Agency for Research on Cancer that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen, and the second being the court cases that have been massively high profile in the US surrounding Roundup. Ending, well, not totally ending, but at least with the announcement that Bayer is making a payout of I think it was $10.9 billion in compensation to sufferers of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma last month. So it's been obviously a key chemical, and is getting more and more of a high profile and recognition as the name. I'd say 3-4 years ago, if you asked most people in America what glyphosate is, they wouldn't even have known. Now it's become a topic of conversation in many different areas, so that's fascinating to see. The process is generally outlined on our website and the standard for the certification. Currently, we have, I think, 99.2% of the glyphosate residue-free certification market. It's a simple verification process. It's not a process-based certification. We base everything surrounding the testing of final products or ingredients through the supply chain. If an ingredient supplier is certifying. For wine specifically, we actually certify just before bottling. So the testing process begins just before bottling, in which we have a random sampling process in place, which the specific vineyards send off to a third-party laboratory that meets the certification standard. When when those samples are received back by the vineyard, they then send them off to us to review and to certify. The main part of the process is that testing process, because after that is literally just paperwork, which takes roughly about 2 weeks to complete. We also require that there's some testing done on the actual final bottled wine, but that's a very small amount. On vineyards that we're working with in the US at the moment, we're doing 3 samples before bottling. That's 3 random samples before bottling, and we're doing 1 of each type of wine once it's been bottled. That's the kind of amount. And just to give you an example of costs for sample testing, it's about $200 per sample. So most vineyards' costs for testing for the certification are between $600 and $1,000 annually. And the certification fee itself, which is an annual fee, is $1,499. So that's really the total cost of the certification on an annual basis. We work with a large number of laboratories in the US and Canada, so it's easy to find a third-party laboratory that meets the standard. And we also provide, as soon as payment has been made, we provide the seal that can be placed on the bottles as well. So that's a pretty easy process compared with a lot of other products which we have to regularly test during the year. Obviously, bottling usually happens once a year, so it's actually easier for wine than many other products. So that's a general overview. We're also focusing a lot of attention on building awareness of the certification specifically for wine. We have a big network of people who are doing media work for us in the US, including the largest mother blogger network in the US called Mamavation. And we've concentrated a lot of trying to get information about each new brand or each new product that's certified out to as wide an audience as possible. I think obviously there's a growing interest in, especially in this period of time around health. So I think that's part of the reason that there's been a pickup of interest recently. We actually from last month also started to work outside the US and Canada. As I mentioned, we've started to work in France, but we're working internationally with a lab called SGS on taking the certification pretty much to currently on 3 continents, soon to be on 4. But we're looking at the moment, as I said at the beginning, where we've got 85 certified brands at the moment. By the end of this year, due to the fact that we know who's going through certification, we should have about 150 brands certified, which will be over 7,000 products. So as I said, it's growing fast. One of the fascinating things surrounding glyphosate and Roundup is that the science really hasn't caught up, obviously, with the public interest, meaning that there hasn't been enough comprehensive science on routes of exposure. But one thing that we found during wine testing specifically is that and this is massively different in different crops. So just to give you an example of how glyphosate is getting into the final product. With wheat or with corn, it's pretty much only getting into the final product if it's been sprayed close to harvest. With wine, that's slightly different. We're finding that glyphosate is likely actually being stored inside the vines because early spraying, meaning late spring time spraying of vineyards, is leading to glyphosate actually turning up in the wine, which we weren't aware of until this year actually. This is the same with lots of soft fruits such as raspberries and other berries, which actually store glyphosate within the plant during the year, and it actually turns up in the fruit at the end. So this is kind of not something that's been studied widely, but just through the amount of testing we've done this year, we started to realize that different plants have a completely different reaction with glyphosate and lead to glyphosate being in the final product at different times. So just to give you an example there's lots of noise somewhere. Someone sounds like they're on a airplane. That seems much better. So one of the interesting things that we found is that a lot of the main crops that are sprayed with glyphosate as pre-harvest have a serious problem only because of that 2, 3, 4 week period before harvest. But as I said, vineyards and some other, including almonds as well, which we don't quite know why that is, but almonds have a specific issue with glyphosate being stored inside the trees and actually coming out in the nuts, even for a period of 1.5 years when glyphosate hasn't been sprayed. So these things are kind of new to science and haven't been studied enough for me to claim as to why that is specifically happening, but it's just something that I've been made aware of from the amount of testing that we've done, which may be of interest. So yeah, that's generally the basics. And Chris, over to you to lead to any questions that anyone has.
That was great. Thanks, Henry. I had kind of a couple questions maybe that before we open it up to the group. You mentioned about the storage of the glyphosate in the plant itself, and I think when we first spoke, you actually gave me a couple of, numbers that you'd seen come through, excuse me, in terms of parts per million. Could you talk a little bit about just the amount that's being stored?
Yeah, so we've had in different parts of the world, it seems that obviously in vineyards, glyphosate is being sprayed at different times of year. But we've had numbers in the actual leaves of the vines coming back up to 20,000 parts per billion. And also there's been other parts of the vines that have been tested which have been coming up quite high. In the grapes themselves, we don't often see anything above 1,000 parts per billion. So there's a big difference between what's stored in different parts of the vine, and that's through the testing we've been doing in France. So yeah, there's definitely more work to be done on identifying how glyphosate is actually spreading through the vine as a plant.
Great. Yeah, I just wanted to get people kind of a sense of how much there actually was in their plants. The other question I wanted to ask was about the certification applies, I think you said, across the entire vintage, right? So if someone gets 3 samples randomly of their wine, their wine before bottling, and then gets another sample after bottling, the certification label can be used on all of their wines from that vintage, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Spot on. Yeah,
that's good. Okay. Those were kind of the 2 questions I had. Does anyone have any questions for Henry while we have him on the line? You can either unmute your microphone or you can chat it in the chat window and I'll ask him. And I'll put up, actually, in the chat window, I'll put up your website, which is detoxproject.org, right?
Yeah, it's spot on, yeah.
And you did mention that live members would actually get a 5% discount on the certification cost, correct? So that's
absolutely. Yeah, that still stands as well. One comment, Chris, on the issue with glyphosate in vineyards. I'm not sure in your area when spraying occurs, but we found specifically that the early spraying doesn't, the most early spraying doesn't often affect, meaning doesn't cause glyphosate to enter the grapes eventually. So it's usually when it's sprayed a little, say late spring, that there's an issue. We don't exactly know why that is, but that's something else.
We had a question about if you would be, let me see if I can understand this. Would you be certifying, could you certify farms rather than the final product? Is that the question, Helen?
Yeah, so got it. Yeah, so we are actually starting to certify farms, but again, basically that's more for the wheat, oats growing area where they're certifying specific farms on the actual harvest. I'm not sure how that would work on vineyards specifically. Helen, what's your thinking on certifying actual farms?
So I grow both hops and wine grapes, and if that just helps us have an edge with our customers, if we have that certification. saying that we are producing glyphosate-free crops, and then helps them promote it. In either they can also get a certification or choose not to.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So yeah, if there's a final, in other words, if there's a final harvested crop that can be tested, and obviously audited, then we can certify the final product that's coming off a specific farm, and we've been doing that for chia, for wheat, for oats, for almonds as well. So yes, to answer the question, we haven't actually done that for vineyards yet, but it's absolutely possible.
Okay, thank you.
Great question, because some of our members don't actually produce wine; they just produce the grapes and they sell the grapes to a winery. So this
is actually a way that some brands are saving money on the certification, because if all of the farms all of their supplying farms are certified, they don't have to go through any testing process themselves. And that's something that we've been doing a lot with wheat and oat products, and some, for example, pea protein. We certify a lot of pea protein farms, meaning pea producing farms, which then go into pea protein. But if all of the suppliers supplying farms are certified, then that pea protein brand doesn't have to pay any money for testing and just has to pay money for the certification fee for using the seal. So that's one useful thing.
Great. There was another question for vineyard grapes. Does it show in the seeds, skins, and/or juicy pulp primarily? Do you know where it's showing up?
Yeah, so it's mainly in the juicy pulp that we've been finding. That's the main part of the grape that has glyphosate in, and that's again through the French testing we've done, because they've been very interested in the specifics of where glyphosate is being found, and so the juicy pulp seems to have the vast majority of the glyphosate in.
And could you talk a little bit, this is a little bit different than what we've been talking about, but can you talk a little bit about your hair test? Because we do actually have someone on the call today who is running an organization that gives health care to the farm workers, and I thought maybe it'd be interesting to also approach it from that angle to see what the exposure is to the farm workers.
Sure, I mean, that's my kind of main area of expertise. So we've been doing hair testing for farm workers all across the European Union, and a lot in China at the moment, for finding long-term exposure. So we started off doing urine testing and blood testing in farm workers back in 2014, but we were finding very little kind of patterns of exposure, and that's partly because of the low levels that are found in urine and blood. So it's difficult to find out where that exposure happened, even for farm workers, whether it's come through their diet or directly from the work that they're doing. But hair testing has changed that, because one, it gives a long-term exposure picture of about 3 to 4 months, whereas urine and blood give 2 to 3 days exposure, and also that we can tell some really interesting patterns as to how regularly they're being exposed, and we've been able to tell, for example, in French farm workers, the specific time that they're spraying compared with their exposure from their diet, because you can actually cut up hair into 1 centimeter pieces and find the specific time frame that exposure happened. About 1 centimeter of hair equals 1 month of exposure. And so you can pinpoint even down to a 2-week period as to where that exposure happened over the last 3, 4, 5 months. And you can also use body hair in that as well for those farmers that don't have much hair left. So the usefulness of hair testing compared with the other previously used testing for farm workers is just astronomical. And so we're working hard to test as many people as possible. We've got a project at the moment of about 7,500 farm workers across Europe who are being tested using hair testing. So, and none in the US. There's been no interest in the US whatsoever. So it will be an interesting project to start up there as well.
Leda, do you have any kind of protocol for testing for pesticides in farm workers? You're on mute.
Okay, there you go. Thank you. That was fascinating. So you say 1 inch of hair equals to 1 month?
1 centimeter of hair, 1 centimeter is 1 month of exposure. So
Oh, wow. Okay.
the lab usually tests about 4 centimeters of hair, if possible, which would equal 4 centimeters of exposure. After that period, the hair doesn't store the chemical that well, so it's usually about a 4-month period.
Mm-hmm. Okay. At this point, if there's an exposure, we just refer to a primary care or to private provider. But this is good because I can start looking into with others, particularly with Oregon Health and Science University. They have an occupational health research component department, and for sure I will talk to them about this and to see how we can collaborate and do some. This was very. So I'll be calling you. Thank you.
Fantastic. That's excellent. One of the interesting things from hair exposure, and this is true for all farmers. I'm a farmer myself. I grew up on a farm and spent all my time around different types of exposure to different types of chemical. One of the fascinating things from the point of view of hair testing that we've done in the European Union is that when farmers started to find out that they were being exposed themselves, it was a totally different reaction that they were getting to testing the final crops that they were actually sending out to be eaten by the general public. So it actually managed to change even to a political level, because we tested lots of politicians within the European Parliament. We tested their hair to increase regulation on the use of farm chemicals within the new, I think they call it the EU Green New Deal, which has come into being this year, which has the aim of reducing the use of farm chemicals by 40% within the next 5 years. So it's amazing how the relationship between personal exposure affects people more than it does through dietary exposure, of telling people, okay, you're eating this or you're drinking this. But when you actually find out your own levels, it does change things for many reasons, partly due to the selfish nature of human beings, I suppose, but it's just how it is.
And so for the hair testing, I know you have multiple different suites of tests. Is there one that's the most popular, and what is the cost on it?
Yeah, so agricultural pesticides, we do home pesticides and agricultural pesticides. Glyphosate is actually separate because it's such a different molecule that it's tested separately. But the most popular is agricultural pesticides, which is a group of 30 ubiquitous agricultural pesticides plus glyphosate, which is $199 for that hair test, and that's through a French laboratory that sends kits out all over the world. So they actually do a lot of testing in the US, but there's no specific organization within the US that has helped that. It's just the general public's interest that has been sending kits from France to the US and then the samples back from the US to France. So that's how the system works at the moment.
Great. And we do have a lab here that a lot of our folks use called ETS. And excuse me, I believe you said that it's the standard is ISO 16095. Is that right?
17025. So ISO 17025, yeah.
And I believe that they are accredited to that.
They are accredited. We've talked in detail to them, and they're an excellent laboratory that meets all of the standard requirements for the certification.
Great. Lucy asks, have you tested any old cellared wines for residue?
An excellent question, and something I missed out from the presentation altogether. Actually, brands and wine brands that want to certify wine that has already been bottled can do so by testing. We have a testing protocol which we can share for wine that is already bottled, so that they can back certify, let's say, that wine and put the seal in some way. Some people I know who in California are actually sticking seals on the bottles and sending them out. So we have tested old cellared wines in France, and there is a reduction in glyphosate over time, and it usually breaks down into AMPA or other metabolites in old cellared wines. So there is a reduction. We haven't quite worked out how long that reduction is yet, but we're thinking in probably a 2 or 3 year period, there's a vast reduction in the glyphosate from the original wine that's bottled to the wine after 2 to 3 years. Sometimes we've mainly tested things around that period, but there is a reduction. But as I said, we've only started testing probably 3-4 years ago, so we haven't got the full picture yet about how much of a reduction.
Great. Do you ever test for any other chemicals besides glyphosate in the wine, like you do with the hair testing?
Well, we do a lot of the companies want to do a full multi-residue test as well as the glyphosate, because obviously glyphosate is tested separately from the multi-residue tests that are done in most laboratories. So it really depends what the specific vineyards or wine brands want from the testing to find out. We haven't done much multi-residue testing ourselves. But we've seen lots of results that have come out from specific vineyards, and fungicides are one of the main issues in final grapes that we've seen. But that's a general comment. It depends what fungicides are used in different parts of the world, but fungicides are definitely the thing that are most getting into the final wine.
Interesting. Well, let's open it up for a few more questions before we let you go. Anyone have any questions? You can chat it in the text window, or you can unmute your microphone and ask. I think this is becoming a very, very important issue these days, and I think what you're doing is really fantastic and valuable, not just to our members, but to the whole food system. So thank you for doing it.
No, thank you, Chris, for giving me this audience. And as I said, anyone who wants to contact me on specifics, I'm happy to answer emails again on a chat as well.
One last question. Could you repeat actually there's a couple more. Could you repeat the fee again for certification?
Yeah, so this is separate from testing, because obviously that's third-party testing, which is completed by the vineyard directly with the laboratory. The testing is an estimated $600 to $1,000 per year, but the actual annual certification fee is $1,499 per year.
Okay, and we have, if glyphosate is used for how many years, but for many years, excuse me, but stopped in 2020, how long will it show up?
Not that long. The main problem with glyphosate is constant exposure. Now, glyphosate has a short half-life compared with a lot of the pesticides that were either previously banned or are still used. In soil, I'd say the maximum would be a 2 to 2.5 year period that we've seen. As I said, with almonds, for example, you're picking up things about a year and a half later. But with most crops, even in the same year, because it's quite water soluble, it's disappearing or breaking down into its metabolites quite quickly. So the big problem with glyphosate is when it's sprayed and the times of exposure specifically. Those are the keys. It's not something like DDT. And just to give you an example of the difference with DDT, we're finding DDT in soils 60 years after it was last sprayed. So, and we're actually just working on a project at the moment in California where they're testing soils for DDT and DDE residues, which is the main metabolite, which is coming up in different crops about 60, 65 years after it was first sprayed. So there are hugely different half-lives for some of these pesticides. And glyphosate's main issue is that it's used so much and constantly.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we have Gordon Burns on the call, who's with ETS, and he's talking about the cost of the samples range from $150 to $190 per sample, and he's given us a link. So thank you, Gordon. I appreciate that. We had one more question about how to set up the actual, I guess, the sampling and the certification. There's a root square testing that you do that you're asking for?
Absolutely. So I can share the specific protocol for testing on an email. It'll be easy to send over, and also it's a very simple protocol for the testing, and also the process for the certification I can send over it as well. As I said, they're not process. It's not a process certification. It's more like a validation. So it's not a complicated process.
Great, and I'll send it to everybody on the call today after the seminar is over.
Cool.
All right. Well, if anyone else has any questions for Henry, you can email him or email me, and I'll email him, whichever way you feel more comfortable. And we'll see if we can get some folks certified.
Excellent. Well, thanks, guys. And I look forward to hearing from you with any questions you might have.